This is Times Radio.
17 minutes past 5. And our front page of the Times this morning is this beautiful photograph that's never been released before of the Prince and Princess of Wales. It's from their wedding day to mark their 13th anniversary yesterday. I kind of always remember their wedding because it was the day after my birthday. So it's kind of got a significant part of my yearly calendar, and it's a fantastic photograph. The Princess of Wales hasn't changed very much or at all. Not the same could be said for the for the Prince of Wales, but it is a wonderful photograph and a glimpse of that day. I'm sure we all remember where we were when we were watching it. The lead story on the Times, though, is the SNP lurches into another crisis as its leader quits. And there's a photograph of Humza Yousaf leaving Butte House yesterday with his wife after he quit as Scotland's First Minister. On the front page of The Guardian, Yousaf quits as the First Minister after the coalition gamble triggers the SNP crisis. Front page of the Daily Mail, we're going to talk about this in a moment. All schools have been warned of a sextortion epidemic. It's teachers who've been giving an alert yesterday about pupils being targeted by sextortion scams. If you're a little bit confused about what that is, we'll get into the detail in just a moment. Andrew Eborn, the barrister and broadcaster, is here with me. Andrew, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie, and a belated happy birthday.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. I had a wonderful weekend celebrating.
Good.
Look, Andrew, we've just been talking about this story with Martina. The legalities, the complexities of the Rwanda plan are, well, they are significant, to say the least. And here we go. This is the big problem. The Home Office have admitted that, do you know what? Of the 5,700 migrants who are supposed to be identified for removal, we don't actually know where the majority of them are.
No, you're absolutely right. A fish called Rwanda. What a nightmare this has been. It's been dominating the headlines for months, hasn't it? And just as we think we've got the act passed, finally, obviously there's problems now about trying to locate all these people. What they've said is there's about 5,700 migrants have been identified for removal, but only 2,145, that's 2,145, continue to report to the Home Office. They've clarified that the remaining 3,557, they're not necessarily absconded, but they're not subject to the same reporting restrictions. And obviously they were hoping that people would sort of stick around because they get their £49 weekly allowance and free accommodation and so on and so forth. But it is obviously a concern. If we don't know where these people are, it's a real difficulty. What I would do, just to put a different spin on it, however, is the real focus should be on these the horrendous people traffickers. And there's a great movie out at the moment which I would recommend called Io Capitano, which gives a different perspective, a sort of Homeric fairy tale about the adventurous journey of two young boys who leave Dakar to reach Europe, and the horrible extortion and blackmail and so on and so forth, and torture they get on the way. It is horrendous. It will continue to dominate the headlines for a little while until Rishi gets a win and at least some people being put on a plane.
Yeah, and will he? That's the thing. I mean, it's always, he's saying, it's going to be definitely when, not if, but I think there's a lot of raised eyebrows about that.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I do think it will be when. They talk about spring, but spring has a very loose definition nowadays. He needs it. It's one of his 5 pledges. All sorts of lawyers will be coming out of the woodwork to say this is what's going to happen. But it was Abraham Lincoln who said if you call the tail of a dog a leg, how many legs does a dog have? Well, it's still 4 because calling a tail a leg doesn't make it so. But what the Rwanda bill has done, or act as it now is basically said Rwanda's a safe country, even though that internationally they may say it's not.
Yeah, the other story I want to talk to you about, Andrew, front page of the Daily Mail, and lots of the papers are covering this morning, is the sextortion that normally we associate with being a crime that is, it's targeted at adults, but teachers have had this warning. They're saying, look, the pupils in your classroom, they are being targeted by this. It's the National Crime Agency speaking to schools. I mean, what are they concerned about it, and how do you tackle it?
Well, it's absolutely appalling. And it's so good to be talking about, and I'll tell you why, is that lots of people will be listening to this who are victims of this terrible extortion, the sextortion. And what it is foreign gangs are blackmailing hundreds of children, probably thousands of children, about intimate pictures online, where they're sort of brought in, if you like. They get enticed by what they think is a real person. But actually it's criminal gangs who persuade them to share intimate pictures. And as a result of sharing those intimate pictures, they open themselves up to blackmail and so on and so forth. And in this day and age where we're living in a diseased information age, where you can fake these pictures as well, the threat of exposing people to their peers, to their family, and the potential humiliation is obviously devastating. And people have taken their lives, and it's appalling. The reality is this is out there, and the more that we can talk about and encourage anybody who's affected by this to talk to somebody, because they're not alone. There are ways of dealing with it. It's absolutely right. But for the National Crime Agency to come out and tell teachers this is a horrendous crime, we've got to make sure that people are aware of it, is really, really a good step.
Yeah, the number of children targeted by criminal gangs has risen by 266% in just 2 years. And, you know, part of that, we're going to talk about this a little bit later. This is one sort of, you put phones in children's hands and suddenly they are then far more exposed to type of crimes and extortion like this. And, you know, it's a real challenge to work out how best to protect them. More on that a little bit later. From page of the Daily Telegraph, Andrew, the story is here. Sex is a biological fact, declares the NHS. The NHS is going to, it's a sort of big announcement a little later on, that sex is a matter of biology in a significant shift against gender ideology. A lot of this, of course, is coming out after the kind of, well, the shadow of the Cass report. What is the change, and is it the right one?
Well, very simple. In 2021, if I remember rightly, the NHS guidance said that trans patients could be placed in single-sex wards based on gender with which they identified. The new proposals basically says that we are defining sex as biological sex. And I always have, it's such an emotive subject, and people on both sides get rightly enraged about it, if you like. But it's about respect for all people in the conversation, not least those who are biological women. It's about safety and so on and so forth in these particular instances. But we've also had an influence on sports where trans women, because they're physically more powerful, are winning all these sporting events. Basically what will happen is the NHS will declare today that sex is a matter of biology. This, as you say, is a significant shift against gender ideology.
Yeah, and do you think, you know, about time?
I think the reality is that you need clear definitions, but also we need to have respect for those who are trans and obviously have a communication, explain again why there needs to be these sort of protections, because you're hearing horrendous cases of people being abused. And I always say it's about respect, but it's about respect for everybody in the conversation, not least biological women who need their safety preserved.
Yeah, I mean, the clarification, says the paper, means that patients wouldn't have to share sleeping accommodation with patients of the opposite biological sex. There'll be much more when they announce that all a little bit later. As you can imagine, Andrew, the papers are full of analysis of what's happened at the SNP, who might take over the helm, and I really enjoyed reading Hugo Rifkind's piece this morning. The fall of Yousaf exposes green pledges as hot air. I mean, it was the green pledges and actually policy issues around things like trans rights that caused so many problems for the SNP. It looks as though, you know, they've made promises and commitments that then when it comes to the climate particularly, they just couldn't keep.
Well, that's right. I mean, always another brilliant piece by Hugo. Congratulations. He quotes the Kevin Costner movie, 1989, Filled of Dreams, and say, if you build it, he will come. And he basically talks about all these promises that were made about the green agenda, and basically they couldn't be fulfilled. So Alex Salmon sort of torments poor old Humza, called him Humza the Brief. The reality is, I felt a bit sorry for the guy seeing him at his press conference. It's rather like the Great Falling. You remember when Maggie Thatcher resigned and she was in tears there?
Why did you feel sorry for him?
Well, I felt sorry because they're behind all the public persona of anybody. I'm a softie, that's why I felt sorry for him. And behind the public persona, basically he was a broken man, I felt. I mean, he was in tears about that sort of side. You're right about what he's done or what he hasn't done. Politically, it's been a bit of a nightmare. But I always feel for that. Behind all of these public people, there are individuals, and individuals have feeling, and I'm a softie for those feelings.
Yeah, of course. I think Hugo's analysis is that the Scottish government promised hugely ambitious policies on net zero, but had zero plans for actually carrying them out. And that's where the coalition was absolutely straining, because the Greens are thinking, you know, OK, great, ambitious pledges, but now we actually need to follow through on them. It's a brilliant read this morning, so I recommend having a look at that.
Absolutely.
Andrew, what's happened with our stamps? This has been such a mess. We've now got these barcoded stamps. Lots of papers talking about this, the Times as well today. People are getting fined if they're using stamps because the allegations that they're counterfeit, but some of them that they're being told are counterfeit actually aren't.
Well, absolutely. So basically, putting the story in perspective, this was these stamps which have come over apparently from China, although China denies it. As soon as they introduced these barcoded stamps, it's been flooded with these dodgy ones. And the instant reaction was that people will get a £5 penalty when they collect their post if they had a counterfeit stamp. They've now shifted the focus and say, look, actually, we're going to put this on pause about who we actually penalise. So you won't get a £5 penalty if you're receiving it. But they basically want to try and start look at those who actually send it and putting an obligation there. And they brought in all sorts of new technology so they can work out what these bogus stamps are. But as you rightly say, it's a bit of a mess because they're getting genuine stamps. They're saying, well, they're not genuine. And the last thing we want is yet another scandal for the post office or anything to do with the mail.
Yeah, well, I mean, also very annoying if you have to pay £5 to receive your letter, which didn't have a counterfeit stamp on in the first place. So they've suspended the fines, and we'll have a bit more of that in the business news as well. Front page of the Times, Andrew, there is a fantastic story, really. A papyrus scroll that was buried when Mount Vesuvius erupted nearly 2,000 years ago has finally been discovered. Modern technology has managed to kind of, in amongst the layers of soot and stain, decipher the sort of damage from the black writing. And we're finding more about Plato's final musings, and they're not hugely profound, it has to be said.
No, it's absolutely. What's happened? My pet subject, artificial intelligence, has helped decipher these scrolls, which basically, as you say, nearly 2,000 years ago, they were buried under meters of volcanic ash. And they've now, as a result of this wonderful technology, been able to decipher some of these, and with the hope that we might be able to work out what's happened. A particular scroll they quote in the Britain's article in the Times today, they're talking about Plato hosting a visitor named only as the Chaldean guest. Although even though Plato himself was suffering from attacks of fever and just hours from death, basically it was sacred. Hospitality for the Greeks was sacred, so he was entertaining him, and apparently he was also listening to a bit of flute music as well, just to keep him going. Well, the hope here, however, is that they're going to be able to look at more and more of these scrolls and to uncover all sorts of glorious things, some wonderful poetry that may have been, we thought was lost, to various other wonderful things. So classicists around the world will be salivating at the prospect.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, we've got such little information, really, of all the sort of historical documents that got lost after the eruption. But should we just look at what he said about the person playing the flute? The scroll carries out a previously unknown account of how he spent his last evening. He was listening to flute music played by a slave girl. It claims he was unimpressed and criticised her sense of rhythm. And that's kind of the last thing we know he thought.
That is awful. Then damned by history after all these years. She was hoping it was being buried. Out it comes. The world is, everybody in the world is a critic, and there we go. The last condemning words from Plato.
So was Plato. Yes, I think maybe we thought there'd be something more profound, but there we go. The flute music was not for him. Andrew, as ever, it has been brilliant. Thank you. Andrew Eborn, the barrister and the broadcaster, going through the day's papers with me.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.